Thanks everyone for coming to our first Calf Club talk. So we're going to be looking at the nutritional sort of values of milk powders and how they affect calf performance on your farms. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along and shout them out or put them in the chat. If we don't get to them, we'll come to them at the end of the talk. But the aim of Calf Club is sort of to have a little bit of a discussion group, learn from each other and how different people are doing different things and how they affect everyone. Just a couple of introductions, because I think we've got farmers from all over, so Bakewell and Whitchurch as well as Lancs. So I'm Becca, this is Emily, we're a couple of vets from up at Lancs. And then we've got Jenny, who's going to be talking with us. She's a vet from Whitchurch, so hopefully you recognise some of us.
Hello.
Next slide. So just as a quick starter, there's a poll just to give us an idea of what everyone's looking for in milk powders. So which do you think is the better milk powders? These are example labels that you'll get on any milk powder that you buy. This is what you'll be able to see on them. Just have a quick look and see which one you think would be the better one to pick. There's no wrong answers.
We'll just give you a second to have a look at the powders and then I'll launch the poll. So I'll launch the poll now. So it's just powder 1, powder 2 or 3. Which do you guys think is better?
Cool. I'll give you a few more seconds. Oh, can I stop it then? So the majority of people have gone with powder 3. Does anyone want to shout out why they picked a certain powder? Or type it in the chat, that's fine. If not, we'll move on. Cool, that's fine. We'll come back to it at the end. Do you want to move on? So the next question is just to get a bit of an idea of what you'd look for again. So what kind of influences your choice of milk powder? Is it price, just that you've always used it, ingredients, or just recommendations? Everyone going for the answer they think they want us to hear. Good, yeah. So it's good to look at the ingredients. That's obviously what's going to influence the nutritional value of your powders. So yeah, good choice. Brilliant. So Jenny's going to give us a bit of an introduction into milk powders, what the different ingredients might mean and what to look out for, and then we'll move on to some field data that we've collected. So thanks, Jenny.
Hello, thanks guys. Yeah, my name's Jenny. I'm a vet down at Whitchurch. A lot of you probably don't know me yet. I've been with the practice about 6 months, but I'm pretty interested in young stock rearing and also nutrition. So I've got a couple of things that I wanted to share with you tonight about what to look for on a milk powder label, and questions that you can ask a milk powder rep to make sure that you're getting the most for the money that you're paying for the powder, and the best for the future of your herd. So I thought I'd start with, sorry, a really dodgy graph. The quality is pretty bad, I'm sorry. But it's some data taken from a large study done by Alana Bolton at the RVC for a number of farms across the UK when she looked at the cost of their heifer rearing. And she found the average cost of rearing a heifer was £1,800 or just over, with a massive variation within that figure. And it'd be interesting to know what the cost of your heifer rearing is. I mean, I don't know how many of you actually know what the cost of your heifer rearing is. If anyone wants to share, feel free. If not, that's fine. But working out exactly what the cost of rearing a heifer, taking everything into account, would be great. So if you look at this graph, age of first calving is a massive impact on cost of rearing heifers. So you probably can't see very well, sorry, but along the bottom is the months. So from 23 months up to 32 months, I think, on the right hand side there, and the percentage difference in rearing a heifer. So changing by just a month can have massive reductions in the cost of rearing heifers, and likewise going the other way can increase. So 20% of total production costs on a farm are due to heifer rearing, second only to feed costs as the most expensive output on your farms. And yeah, age of first calving massively affects this. On top of that, 15% of heifers born alive don't actually go on to even make lactation number 1, and 19% of heifers don't go on to make lactation number 2. And she won't start to pay you back until midway through lactation number 2. So almost a third of all live born heifers actually never pay you back for what you've put into them. So I just thought it was quite interesting and food for thought about why we're doing this meeting, really. Can you flick me on? So most of my talk is going to be about feeding pre-weaned calves. So we've got a couple of aims. Obviously, when feeding them, one is to maintain them. Obviously, one is to get them to grow. We want them to grow at least 0.8 kilos a day, so they're achieving those body weights required at weaning and calved down at 23, 24 months. And we also want their rumen to develop. They need to develop from a monogastric animal, like a pig, to a rumen, obviously. I'm not going to cover anything to do with rumen development today, and we're only going to focus on maintenance and growth. And to get that in the calf, sorry, Betsy, can you flick on? That is the milk feeding period. So milk provides all the energy and protein needed for maintenance and growth to the calf in the pre-ruminant phase. It is not yet able to take any energy from starter and forage. So starter and forage are important. We're not going to talk about them today. They're important to develop their rumen. But no matter what we do with our calves, we're never going to develop their rumen quicker than 6 to 8 weeks. So even if we withhold that milk, or try to feed them less milk to try to encourage them to eat starter and forage in this phase, their rumen is never going to develop quicker, and they won't be able to get the energy they require to grow well and to hit those growth rates. Obviously, water as well, really important to maintain growth rates and also a healthy calf. The milk rearing phase is 10.8% of the cost of a total heifer rearing phase. So although I think often the outputs in the milk rearing phase can seem expensive, we often talk about milk powders in pounds per tonne, and they can seem like a lot of money. Yeah, I guess important to try and break it down. And as it's such a short period of time, even though the outlays seem a lot, the actual costs in that period are relatively small compared to the rest of the rearing period for the heifer. And 37% of the costs of that pre-ruminant phase, the milk feeding period, are down to the milk that you feed. So I think we've got a mixture of people feeding whole milk and calf milk replacer tonight. I think probably like 3 or 4 people are feeding whole milk that I know of. Yeah, I don't know if anyone again wants to comment, but definitely more common to feed calf milk replacer. These are my thoughts really on the two different systems. When I'm talking about feeding whole milk, obviously we're talking about feeding saleable milk. So dump milk, antibiotic milk, shouldn't be fed to heifer calves. Antibiotic resistance is proven to be a real problem when feeding antibiotic milk to heifer calves, and animals that are fed antibiotic milk are much more likely to go on to get mastitis and also be resistant to antibiotics. So really we're talking about saleable tank milk. Potentially it's easier than mixing up calf milk replacer. Potentially we're getting some more immune factors when we feed that, like feeding extended colostrum. Obviously it's nature's feed, so it's highly digestible, it's got high fat and protein, usually has an ME of around 22 megajoules per kilogram of dry matter. I think the downsides of feeding whole milk, the big one really is disease, and that's why I think we've seen a move away from feeding whole milk, certainly in the last 5, 6 years that I've been a clinical vet. we've seen a move away from feeding it. Obviously, Johne's disease is a big one. Eliminating the risk associated with Johne's disease is difficult, but other diseases, mycoplasma, etc., can be spread by whole milk as well. Another downside is that it can be variable, so your milk quality is not going to be the same every day, and calves hate inconsistency, and it is low in vitamins and trace elements, so it can cause problems in calves. You can get iron deficiency in calves where they're fed whole milk. Calf milk replacer, obviously, hopefully more consistent as long as we mix it up consistently, disease-free, Johne's-free, and hopefully the composition is tailored to the calf's needs. But as we discover, that's not always the case. Although actually the milk powders that you guys have sent in tonight, overall the quality is pretty good. I was pleasantly surprised, but there certainly is a massive variation, I think, in quality of powders on the market. So moving on to looking at the ingredients of calf milk replacers and how we can decide if it's a good or a bad one. Again, really, I just wanted to touch back to the costings. That Alana Bolton study is really worth a read, and it's really worth figuring out these figures, I think, for your farm, cost of heifer rearing, including all your inputs, but some of these other figures as well. Obviously, pound per ton of calf milk replacer, you guys will all know, and that's often the headline figure, especially if changing up to a more expensive milk replacer, which seems to get more expensive every year. They can seem like a lot of money, but breaking it down into pounds per calf per day. So the average in this Alana Bolton study was £3.14. But again, a massive variation from £1 something up to £6 something on calves in this study. So how much is it actually costing you each day? Pound per milk feeding period, obviously probably influenced by weaning time and milk feeding length, as well as feed rates and things. But the average cost in the Alana Bolton study was £195. Again, massive variation. But something that's not really talked about and not really quoted is pound per kilo of daily live weight gain. The girls at Lancs have done a couple of graphs for you later on for your data, where we just look at some of these figures. I think it's just a different way of looking at it, and are you actually getting the money back for the milk replacer that you're feeding? So there's two main types of calf milk replacer. On the ones sent in, I think it might have been 50-50 split. I can't remember, but they're either whey based or they're skim based. So obviously skim based is like whole milk. It forms a clot in the abomasum, like you can see on the screen, the same as whole milk would, and that clot is slowly released throughout the day into the small intestine where the milk proteins are digested. Something to look out for on skim powders, although I don't think any of the labels I saw had this on, but there's no legal limit for the inclusion of percentage skim. So skim powder can be listed as an ingredient on the powder, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a skim powder. So you need to have above 20% skim really to get a really decent clot forming in the abomasum. And certainly if you're getting less than 5% skim in the powder, you'll get a weak clot like this one here, and that can be detrimental for calf health. Skim powders are often, or they are more expensive than whey powders, but again, just checking how much skim is in a powder is something that we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's another question to ask who you get a milk replacer off, and make sure that it's got a decent amount of skim in it. Whey-based powders are made up of whey-based proteins. These don't form a clot in the abomasum, and they're digested in the small intestine. Manufacturing processes of the whey will affect the digestibility and also the quality, and not all whey is equal. So not all whey on a label is going to be good whey. Some of it won't be the best kind of whey, and I think that's probably one of the key things again to look for in the ingredients that we'll go on to later on. So what can you glean from the label? So obviously the first thing is the analysis, like you get salad analysis, so proteins, oils, fibers, ash, and your vitamins. So this will give you an overall idea of the key figures, but I guess just be wary that you'll have the protein, but you won't necessarily have the digestibility of those protein sources available to you, and the amounts of those protein sources that are in the powder, and not one protein source is not equal to another protein source. You'll have your oil, but again, you won't have your fat sources. Fiber and ash can give you an indication of the quality of the powder, and your vitamins. So I think as well as looking at the overall figures and having some idea of what overall figures we want to be looking for, you need to also look at the label and the ingredients on the label. So the ingredients are listed in order of inclusion from highest to lowest, but you don't have any idea what actual percentage they're in at. So again, that can be another useful question to ask when choosing a powder and get more information from the manufacturer. So these are the key figures that I think you should be looking for. So crude protein content above 23%, crude fat above 20%. This used to be pretty hard to achieve. Powders used to be, and some are still are, historically quite low in fat, around 17, 18, with higher protein contents. This is probably something that's changed in the industry over the last couple of years, with some research out of trials, research station in the Netherlands, that I'll show you in a little bit, but fats are coming up in powders now. But yeah, over 20% really you want to be aiming for. Crude fiber, so high fiber levels can indicate a lot of plant proteins or non-milk proteins, which calves can't digest as well as milk proteins. You know, obviously calves are calves, they're designed to digest milk and not plants until they're ruminants. And yeah, lots of plant proteins or non-milk proteins aren't that well digested by young calves. And ash content, again, keeping ash content less than 7.5, lots of ash can be used to bulk out powders, and again, calves can't digest it. So I think having those key things in mind, making sure that the calves requirements are met, and also looking at the label and looking at the actual ingredients. But generally, as fewer ingredients as possible is what we want to see. So this is some of the research from the trial farm in the Netherlands. And they did this research probably 4 years ago now. They've published quite a lot of it already. And I think 3 of the farms that we saw powders for were feeding the trial sort of enhanced fat milk powder, energized calf milk. But if you look at, this is percentage of body fat at birth. If you look at a calf, it's only got 2.8% body fat at birth, which is pretty low compared to lots of other species. And this body fat obviously has to be made up as it grows, and to maintain it and to provide it with energy. So the idea that we can feed calves powders that are low in fat, and they don't need fat, is outdated. People used to think that if we fed calves powders that were high in fat, they might get insulin resistant, and we might have metabolic problems later in life when they join the herd, ketosis, fatty liver, things like that. But actually the work shows that even though if you feed them high fat powders, they do become a little insulin resistant when they're pre-weaned. By the time they're weaned and they hit 300 days, this effect is no longer seen. It doesn't carry with them into adulthood. And then obviously you've got the vitamins on the label. Most of these are supplied sufficiently by UK powders. And you don't need to worry about the one to watch is vitamin E. And according to the National Research Council's requirements, a calf needs 250 international units of vitamin E a day. But there is potentially some evidence that this figure may need to be more. And in the new NRC requirements published, this may well go up. So I think looking at what your vitamin E is on the powder, making sure it's at least 250, but lots of powders will have higher levels of vitamin E in, and potentially, there's a benefit to this. But again, if you're feeding whole milk, being aware that it's likely to be deficient in some of these vitamins. So I think a couple of years ago, there was a real trend to pushing high protein powders, high protein and lower fat powders. And this is some data from 2006. Published in the Journal of Animal Science, which compares different protein percent powders, so from 14 up to 26. And you can see it was fed at 2 different rates. So the blue line is 10% of body weight, and the red line is 14% of body weight. And you can see that as the powder was increased from 22 to 26% crude protein, there was no benefit, there was no statistically significant benefit in average daily gain for feeding this higher protein. And actually at the lower rate of feeding, so at 10% of body weight powder fed, there was a reduction in growth rates. And this was probably because the calves didn't have enough fat to utilize all that extra protein. And so they actually had a reduction in growth rates because they had to use energy to get rid of the excess protein that was being supplied to them. So I think the current science and thinking is that we don't need to be pushing for these high protein 26% powders, and actually above 22, you're not going to get any greater benefit. Again, that same data from the trial station, but published slightly later in 2009, shows the same effect. So again, a powder that was fed 22.5% protein versus 26% protein. If you look at the average daily gain here, where the red line is, no difference in average daily gain between the two different proteins. So I think it's important to start by looking at those overall headline figures and always having that crib sheet in mind, when selecting powders and making sure that your powder fits those criteria first. But I then think part two of the puzzle really is looking at those feed ingredients and trying to get some more information. I find some companies are fantastic at sharing info with you, which is great, and some are less keen. Normally rings alarm bells if they don't want to tell you information. But you can glean quite a lot from that ingredients list without getting any further info out of them. But I think a couple of questions that I would always ask: if it is a skim powder, is skim the main ingredient? Is it the first ingredient? Which would generally suggest it has enough skim in it, or is it marketed as a skim powder, but skim's actually the third or fourth ingredient, in which case I would be wary there wasn't enough skim in it. But if you can find out the percentage skim, then that's great. Not all whey is equal, so I'll talk about that in a couple of slides time, but just being aware that there are different types of whey and which ones to look out for on the label. Is the powder 100% milk protein, or has it got non-milk proteins in it as well? Again, something that you can just glean from the label fairly easily, and there are now more and more 100% milk protein powders coming to the market in the last couple of years. Again, that's really taken off. And then what is the osmolality of the milk powder? So that question is a question that you'd have to ask the manufacturer. But again, some of the different ingredients on the label can give you a clue. For those that don't know, osmolality is the concentration of the solutes in solution. So it's how concentrated a solution the powder is. And powders that have too high osmolality, they can pull water out of the calf into the gut and cause a nutritional scour and obviously dehydration. Milk is around whole milk is around 300 osmolality, and really obviously we want milk powders to sort of match that, but they can be a lot higher than that, 2-3 times higher. So as I just explained, really the osmolality concept, and again that's research that's sort of taken off in the last couple of years. So things that can increase your osmolality are individual ingredients of the milk powder. So non-milk proteins can increase it, and some of your types of whey can also increase it. But things that you do on farm can increase it. So you're mixing concentrations. It used to be commonplace for us to advise increasing concentration of powders. So in cold weather, pushing concentrations up to 175, 180 grams a litre. And we've moved away from this now as we've understood this concept of osmolality. We can make it too concentrated and you can end up causing abomasal bloat, scours, even deaths potentially, if your osmolality is too high. So looking at the different types of whey on a traffic light system, obviously top one is best. So whey protein concentrate, or whey protein, is your best form of whey. It's got the lowest osmolality because it's got the most protein in it. It's similar to skim powder, it's about 35% protein content. And if this is the first ingredient in a whey powder on the label, then you're off to a good start. Delactose whey, sometimes also called whey powder low in sugar. Obviously, it's had some of the lactose removed. Generally, you get lower performance from this kind of whey because it's got less protein in it. Some of the lactose has been removed, and you end up with a high ash to replace this lost lactose, higher osmolality because of that. And you can have sodium and potassium being too high in delactose whey, which again can affect abomasal motility. So if I see this on a label, you definitely don't want to see this as one of your first couple of ingredients. And if you see it lower down, I guess just be a little bit wary that it could increase the osmolality of the powder, and perhaps go back to the manufacturer and ask what that osmolality is. And then the worst type of whey really, which isn't in there as a protein source, so whey powder, which is pretty confusing because it sounds pretty similar to whey protein, but whey powder or whey powder low in protein is mainly a lactose source. So protein is gone from that whey source, it's mainly a lactose source. again, can increase osmolality. It doesn't have much protein in it. So if I saw whey powder near the top of a whey powder, a whey calf milk replacer label, you know, I'd be worried about where that protein was coming from, because it's probably not actually coming from the whey powder. So you hunt on down the ingredients list and find some other protein sources to suggest where that protein might be coming from. So already touched on this a little bit, but non-milk proteins or plant proteins, although you can get egg proteins included in milk powders, it's not always plant proteins. But the NRC recommendations are that calves less than 3 weeks of age aren't fed any of them. So they should receive 100% milk proteins in their calf milk replacer, which obviously makes total sense. You know, that's what they were designed to do. But plant proteins are often utilized, or were often utilized, commonly by powder manufacturers because they were obviously cheaper, but they can't be utilized as efficiently by calves. And again, you could have plant protein sources on your label and a respectable overall protein percentage, but the calves can't utilize all that protein because they can't utilize that plant protein. Older calves can utilize it better. And if you wanted to have a system where you fed, you know, a top quality 100% milk protein powder to younger calves, moving them on to a less good quality with plant proteins, you know, later as they got towards weaning, potentially, you know, that would be okay. But ideally, you know, you want your calves to have complete access to all the protein that you're paying for and that you're providing them with. And there is a statistically significant reduction in the digestibility of non-milk proteins. You also get effects such as increased gut time. You potentially can get bloat, again, nutritional scours, and numerous studies have shown reduced live weight gains and increased mortality. So this is a bit of a summary of some of those papers. So you can see as the milk protein percentage is replaced from all milk to 70% plant protein, you can see that the average daily gain in the third column there reduces and morbidity in the calves increases. And again, back to that Alana Bolton study, for every calf that we lose before she manages to calve down, that costs £193 per every heifer left, because obviously the cost of rearing that animal then has to get spread amongst the remaining animals. So massive, massive costs then put onto your average cost of rearing a heifer if you're getting high levels of mortality in calves. And again, a study to show the effects of feeding hydrolyzed wheat gluten. So a commonly used plant protein you'll see commonly on powder labels, but as the concentration of hydrolyzed wheat gluten increases along the bottom axis, the two lines, red line represents the average daily gain of the calves reducing, and the green line is the hip width, again reducing as calves are just not growing as well because they can't utilize that plant protein. And just to finish off, a couple of slides on how we feed and how much we feed. So again, the girls from Lancs have done some graphs on this, but I think it's now enhanced milk feeding is probably now quite commonplace. And we've recognised that we actually need to feed higher planes of nutrition. Typically, calves were fed probably 2 litres twice a day, and not very much milk powder, 560 grams for the whole day. This has probably doubled to be commonplace to feed a kilo of calf milk replacer a day now to calves, and they'll drink 8, 10, 12 litres. I had a crossbred farmer that I worked with that her calves, they'd happily drink 12 litres a day, and these are little Jersey crosses, but when they got going, they really flew. So I think feeding calves more, obviously, it's nothing new here, is it? It makes total sense. The more you feed them, the better growth rates you get. But there's actually a lot of information, a lot of studies now which show that not only do you get better growth rates, but you actually go on to get increased yield in the first lactation. Some evidence you get better fertility, and when they've looked at mammary gland weights, you get heavier mammary glands as well from enhanced milk feeding. Frequency of feeding, sorry, this is a bit of a wordy slide. I guess most people feed their calves twice a day unless they're on auto feeders. In nature's way, so obviously a suckler calf would suckle off its mum 10 to 15 times a day. And obviously legally calves have to be fed twice a day until they're at least a month old. But just an interesting paper that I found out of the University of Wisconsin, they increased the times they fed the calf from 2 to 3, but they didn't actually change the total amount of milk replacer fed. but they got a massive increase in growth performance just by increasing the amount of feeds. They also got an earlier age of first calving and more milk back in that first lactation. So exactly the same input, it wasn't costing them any more apart from the labour to deliver that third feed, but they got, you know, more output at the other end. So, you know, interesting, and I guess guys on auto feeders perhaps have seen similar things when they've increased feedings per day. And finally, I think tips for mixing, make sure you weigh your powder out. So most people probably use a scoop, but actually how much is the scoop? How much does that weigh? Making sure you're testing that for every new batch of powder. The density of different batches of powder, you know, can change by 10 to 15%. Similarly, the bags at the bottom of the pallet have been compacted a different density to the bags at the top of the pallet. How long has it been in the warehouse for? You know, you can get big changes there. I spoke to a colleague tonight who had just been to a farm doing a bit of a calf audit, and they thought they were feeding 375 grams of powder twice a day, but actually when they weighed it out, they were only feeding 75 grams. But you know, they hadn't realised, and they've obviously just not been calibrated right, and a couple of things have gone wrong there. But so I think always making sure you're weighing milk powder, if not every time, at least once a week, checking that calibration. Concentration. So again, not going too high, not pushing the osmolality up. Check your auto feeders. Are they feeding enough powder to the calves? You know, what feed rate are they feeding out at? And making sure you're adding powder to the water and making it up to the volume, so it's actually fed at the concentration you intend and not more dilute. And then temperatures as well. You know, making sure you're feeding at the right temperature, making it easy for the calf to get everything they can out of that powder, and put the most into growing. I think that's that. I think the girls have got some field data now, which goes through some of your powders and some of the data they found associated with it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. I hope that's given everyone a bit of a background on the importance of milk powders and what we're actually looking at. Like Jenny said, we're going to go into a bit of field data and look at individual powders that you guys are using. So our vet techs have been out and about on our routine farms picking up milk powder packets, and we've been analysing them to have a look at what powders you're using and what ingredients are in them. So this slide just gives you an idea of the types of powders that people are using. So there's quite a lot of our farms using the traditional powders. This is across 22 farms up here. So there's about 5 farms using the energized powders. So as Jenny kind of alluded to before, these energized powders were kind of created to hopefully mimic whole milk a little bit more, so lowering the amount of lactose and increasing the amount of fat and protein, but we'll look into that a bit more. And then there's still a couple of farms, about 3 or 4 farms, feeding whole milk as well up here. So yeah, this kind of breaks down the different constituents of the milk powders, so into protein, fats, ash and lactose. At first glance, they all kind of look vaguely similar, but when you break them down, so looking at whole milk down at the bottom, you've got low levels of lactose, higher fat and protein, and then a little bit of ash in the middle. And then looking at the energized milk powders, they're obviously a bit higher in lactose than the whole milk, but still got really good levels of fat and protein in there. And the Whey Supernova as well is also a really good milk powder. You then look at the traditional ones, and they're all vaguely similar from looking at the graphs. They have slightly higher lactose contents than the energized and the whole milk, but all in all, from that graph, look relatively the same. So the next graph shows the energy that you're getting from each milk powder. Energy is given in megajoules per kilogram. So it's measured as metabolizable energy, which is sort of the best estimate of dietary energy available for use by the calves. So calves have a minimum energy requirement that's used to maintain their body weight, but any extra energy above that can be used towards growth. So the more energy they can get, the better potential for their growth rates. So again, looking at whole milk, like we said on the previous slide, that's lower in lactose and higher in fat and protein. And as Jenny said before, fat's a really good source of energy for the calves, so that's higher in metabolizable energy. You're then followed by the energized milk powders, which are also fairly high, and the Whey Supernova. As we said on the previous slide, looking at the constituents of the traditional milk powders, they all looked vaguely the same. but you can see that slight changes in the protein or the fats can really change the energy available from the rest of the traditional powders. There's quite a varying level of energy on that graph there. So yeah, small differences on the packet can actually make quite a big difference in the amount of energy available to the calf for growth, so it's worth thinking about. So this kind of looks at the fat against metabolizable energy. So like Jenny was saying, we never really thought of fat as the most important constituent of milk powder, but we're realizing it more and more. So if you look at the yellow dot on the graph, that's the amount of fat available in whole milk, and it's obviously given a really high metabolizable energy, so more energy available for that calf to grow. You've then got in the middle the green dot, which is the energized calf powders and also the Whey Supernova in there. And then your more traditional powders sort of lower down the graph with the lower amounts of fat in there and giving a lower metabolizable energy. So the next graph is lactose against NE. So historically, like Jenny was saying, lactose was sort of a higher constituent in traditional powders. So down at the bottom there, they've got really high percentage lactose, but it doesn't necessarily give enough energy for the calves. We've then got the whole milk on the other side of the spectrum with the lower lactose levels and higher metabolizable energy. So yeah, like Jenny said, there's loads of different sources of protein available in different powders. It's important to know which protein sources are available. So we were saying before, the Whey Supernova, which is down near the bottom, isn't an energized calf powder, but it does have a similar constituent to whole milk and the other energized ones. The difference being between that and the Wednesday elixir is that it's whey protein rather than skimmed milk powder. So just the difference in digestibility is something there to think about. Is all that energy actually easily digestible by the calf? So this just kind of gives an example of how the different ingredients are laid out on the packet. So Calves Whisk Plus, we can see there, as Jenny said, the higher the amount of the ingredient, the higher up it comes on the list of ingredients on the back of the packet. So Calves Whisk Plus has a high level of whey protein, and skimmed milk powder comes second. So that suggests that the main protein source in Whisk Plus is the whey powder, and then skimmed milk comes second to that. You can see that the three highlighted grey boxes, they're the protein sources. So there's only 3 protein sources in the Whisk Plus. But when you look at the Dugdale Nutrition Pro Skim, there's 5 ingredients there. So although the skimmed milk is top of that list, there's a lot of other protein sources available. So that's pushing down the percentage sort of concentration of the skimmed milk in there. So like Jenny said, although it's top of the list and looks like that's the main protein source, is there actually enough in there to form a clot and get that digestibility from the powder? So after hearing what Jenny said and looking at the individual graphs, we've just come back to the polls and see if it changes your answer, now thinking more about what to look for in the milk powders and the actual ingredients that are in there. So we'll restart the poll.
They're the same powders as before, so see if your answers change maybe.
I think it's probably important to say that you have to make some assumptions about the powders because you don't actually know like the percentages of the ingredients. But I guess having 3 on powder 3, having 3 non-milk sources there, you know, potentially raises alarm bells. If that was just one non-milk source, would it be a higher percentage and would it be higher up the list? I mean, it might not be, they might be in very low percentages, but you just don't know that information. And I think, you know, sometimes companies will put more than one non-milk protein or non-milk source in there to make them go lower down the list than they would otherwise have been. But I guess it's just asking more information from the companies that you're buying the products from.
Yeah, we'll end it there.
So when we first asked the question, the majority of people went with powder 3, but now you're all going with powder 2. So well done. I think we've learned something from Jenny, which is great. Yeah, so can you just stop sharing? So powder 2 obviously has a higher fat content. And like we said before, the skimmed milk's top of the list of ingredients on there. And there are less protein sources within powder too. So yeah, perfect.
Right, so as Becca said, the vet techs up in ranks have been collecting some of your milk powder packets from their routine farms. And on 22 of those farms, the techs are also weighing the calves regularly. And every 4 months, we get a benchmarking graph of all those farms that looks like this. And it will probably be quite familiar to the guys up in ranks from here. But for those of you who haven't seen it, this is our most recent one. And it sort of goes from daily, we've got some farms achieving greater than 0.9 kilos of daily live weight gain, down to some that are slightly lower down the list. So we've used these growth rates along with the information collected from the milk powder packets and how people are feeding in terms of how much they're feeding and what concentration they're feeding on farm to produce the graphs on the next couple of slides. So as Jenny spoke about earlier, a good way of looking at spend on milk powder is cost per kilo of daily live weight gain. So the farms in this graph are in the same order as they were on the last slide. So on the left, you've got the higher growth rates, and on the right, you've got the lower growth rates. We've taken a couple of farms out, so there aren't the full 22 here, and that's just the farms we didn't have the full cost and cost data for. So to calculate these figures, we worked out the volume of milk powder used per calf per day at approximately 4 weeks old, based on the concentrations that people are feeding and the volume of milk replacer they're feeding. We then use the price per tonne of the milk powders to calculate the cost of that quantity of milk powder, and that gives you a cost per calf per day, which is shown in the orange line. And then the blue bar is the cost per kilo of daily live weight gain. So we took that cost per calf per day and divided it by people's most recent growth rates. And that's shown in your blue bars. So the cost per kilo of daily live weight gain is a great measure because many higher quality milk powders can sound expensive when quoted at a cost per tonne. But if the calves achieve a better growth rate, this can make the cost a more efficient one, and the return on investment can actually be greater, with calves growing quicker, potentially weaning sooner, reaching bulling weights earlier, and hopefully, ultimately, calving down sooner and entering the milking herd faster. So if we just take a worked example and we have a look at farms 14 and farm 1, so both farms are achieving a similar average daily live weight gain, either a bit above or close to the target of 0.8 kilos per day. So farm 14 are feeding a milk powder that's costing approximately £2,250 a tonne, and farm 1 are feeding one costing a bit less at £2,073 a tonne. And looking at the cost per calf per day, which is often historically how we've looked at what people are spending on milk powder, farm 1's costs would be £1.94 per calf per day, and farm 14 would be £2.03 per calf per day. So given those figures, it would be easy to say that farm 14 are spending more on milk powder, and they're both achieving similar growth rates. But when you calculate it on a cost per kilo of daily live weight gain, farm 1 has a higher cost per kilo of daily live weight gain. So they're at £2.44 compared to farm 14, whose cost per kilo of daily live weight gain is only £2.32. So although farm 1 appears to be spending less on milk powder at first glance, if we're just looking at that cost per calf per day figure, farm 14, because they're achieving those slightly better growth rates, their cost per kilo of daily live weight gain is lower. And so they're getting a better return on that investment because their calves are growing better and achieving that bit more. So it's a great figure, cost per kilo of daily live weight gain, but it's not always the full picture. So farms, particularly those towards the lower end of the growth rate, may not be maximising the potential of their milk powder. And so their cost per kilo of daily live weight gain may be elevated, not because they're spending lots on milk powder, but because their growth rate is low, and that might well be due to other issues on farm. So they may be feeding an appropriate level of milk powder to achieve a growth rate that would put them at the top of the graph, up at 0.8, but because their growth rate is being influenced by other factors, and that might be pushing them slightly further down and inflating this cost probably falsely. And we'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. So this graph looks intimidating at first. And the first thing to say is we've taken some of the farms away. So we're only looking here at farms that are achieving a growth rate below 0.75 kilos per day. So we're looking at those farms lower down the growth rate chart who maybe want to improve their growth rates and sort of move slowly up the rankings a bit. And these are the farms who might not be achieving the potential growth that the energy they're feeding would allow them to. And so we break this graph down. In the blue bar is showing you the metabolizable energy, so the energy required to achieve a 0.8 kilogram per day growth rate. And they're all slightly different because it's based on average weights of calves across those farms. So they're all slightly different, but they're broadly the same. The orange bar is showing the metabolizable energy that is being provided by the milk powder they're being fed at the rate they're being fed it and the concentration they're being fed it. The grey line is just showing you the most recent growth rate, so you can see that we're still trending downwards as we go towards the right. And then the yellow line shows the litre of milk that each calf is fed daily, and that's using the left-hand scale. So everyone on this graph is feeding between sort of 5.5 and 10 litres per calf per day. Although we haven't included the amount of milk powder shown on this graph, most farms are feeding similar concentrations. There's a bit of variation from 125 to 150 grams per litre, but that means that the amount of milk powder a day, that line would closely mirror the litres per milk fed. So we not included that to try and make it slightly more simple. So the graph shows that the majority of farms are feeding appropriate amounts of milk replacer to meet the energy requirements for calves to achieve the target growth rate of 0.8. So you can tell that because the orange bars are equal to or higher than those blue bars. So that the orange is what they're feeding and the blue is what they need. There are a couple of farms whose energy from milk replacer that they're feeding to the orange bar doesn't match the required energy to grow at 0.8. So they're the farms where the orange bar is slightly lower than the blue. And it's interesting, if you look at the yellow line, that on some of those farms, they are the farms who are feeding a little bit less volume of milk. So you've got farm 9 who are feeding 5.5 litres per calf a day, and farm 19 are feeding 6, whereas some of the farms, lots of the farms are feeding 8, and we've got one feeding 10 litres per day. So it might be worth considering on those farms, increasing the volume fed to potentially increase growth rates, but it might not be the only fix. It is probably worth noting, it doesn't take into account any energy from concentrate feed, and this data is taken from 4 weeks. So whilst that's not going to be providing them with all the energy they require, they're going to be nibbling away at a bit of it, and they're going to be starting to get some energy from that, and that's not on here. And I think the big thing to say in this graph is actually lots of farms are feeding enough to achieve a higher growth rate. So it might well be that there's other factors going on farm that are meaning their growth rate isn't achieving what we'd like it to be. So as discussed on the previous slides, and as with anything, growth rates are affected by multiple factors, and calves may not be achieving those growth rates despite being fed enough to do that. So some of those factors are on the screen, and this is probably stuff familiar to lots of you guys. So you've got calving and colostrum. So birth weight of calves will make a difference in terms of how quickly they grow and what weights they achieve. And colostrum is key, as with anything, and getting that immune response early, getting those immune systems started and getting those antibodies from the colostrum will help prevent disease. So disease is going to affect growth rates in lots of ways, partly because they're using a bit of energy to fight the disease, and partly because they're going to be eating less, because calves with scour and pneumonia are going to have a decreased intake. Scour also is going to interrupt the absorption of nutrients from the gut, so they're not getting all the nutrients in there as well. Jenny mentioned it earlier, but water is really important, and as well as helping support rumen development, it also can help growth rates. So one study's shown that fresh water being fed alongside milk can increase growth rates by up to 38%, and can also increase the concentrate intake by 31%. In terms of other factors, there's breed. One of the farms on the benchmarking graph is a purely Jersey herd, and their calves grow really well, but they're probably not going to achieve a 0.8 because they're always going to be slightly smaller calves. Housing, as with anything, there's temperature, ventilation, drainage, and humidity are all going to affect disease status. But temperature as well is also key, because calves are going to use some of that energy to keep themselves warm. So below 10 degrees, they start requiring more energy to keep themselves warm. So for every 5 degrees below 10, they require an additional 1.1 megajoule of energy a day. And so some farms and some milk powders recommend increasing the concentration that milk powders mix to in the winter months to increase the energy content of that milk. And you've also got hygiene, and hygiene is a major one in terms of getting that disease control right and preventing other things affecting your growth rates. And then obviously you've got the milk feed, and the energy, as we've discussed this evening, varies across different milk feeds. And there's going to be a different amount available depending on what concentration we're feeding to and how much we're feeding. But it's important to note, really, the point of this slide is to say that actually it's not going to be the magic bullet that fixes your growth rates. It's just a bit of a component to go with that. But that's about all from us. Thank you so much for giving up some of your Thursday evening, and I hope you found it useful and informative. A particular thanks to Calves Billington, who's given us some sponsorship.